For many years, the counting of Pentecost has been somewhat of a source of controversy within the churches of God, causing some at certain times to separate themselves, establish their own groups, form a new one. Last year, when Passover occurred on a Sabbath and the first day of unleavened bread occurred on a Sunday, there was no weekly Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread, and the controversy mounts. And even in our group here, there was a question that arose, and unfortunately, there was some disunity, I guess, with some ideas and documents being circulated around and causing a little bit of a distortion regarding what is frankly a very simple and consistent, straightforward instruction from what's in the Bible regarding the counting, leading some to even keep 2 different days last year, just trying to cover all the bases. And, when you think about it, 1 Corinthians 14:33 tells us that God's not the God of disorder, but the God of peace. And, when we think about it, unfortunately, that was a bit of a phenomena that does occur periodically throughout the time frames of when we see the holy days. Fortunately, this year, that particular phenomena didn't really occur because we actually had the first day of unleavened bread on a Sabbath. So when you think about it too, the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, can be a holy day, but a holy day can in some cases not be on a weekly Sabbath. And that's where sometimes this controversy creates and mounts into distortions. And I remember the first time this really came up after we and my family had decided that we could no longer stay in one of the big corporate churches of God. And, it came up and we were in a small group, and the question was, well, what do we do? Because in many cases, many people don't count for themselves these days. They have a calendar or a little pocket thing that says these are the holy days, and they just go with that. And it does create a situation where we need to be cautious in what we read, whether it's online, even from churches of God, even from people that speak from this particular pulpit, even from me. We need to be careful with what's in the Word of God and be careful. But, going back to this particular time that this occurred, it was impactful to me because, to be quite frank with you, up until the early 90s, when this particular event occurred, it never been a controversy because everyone just did what the corporate church leadership said. This is what the time is. And no one even, well, I shouldn't say no one, I never counted anything. I just said, okay, well, this is the day and the holy day, and this is what we're going to do. And because it came up, it was impactful to me because of many things. When I came out of the quote unquote corporate world of churches of God, I began to decide, what? Let's put the booklets down for a little bit. Let's put down the hierarchy down for a little bit. Let's look and see what's in the Bible. And it was amazing, the things that I personally learned during that period of time. It caused some problems and conflicts within families and friends and whatnot that I'd known for years in the church. But there was an inner peace that I'll have to say that I felt that I had not felt before. And I personally believe a lot of that was because I was no longer relying on others. I was actually very much involved in my own belief system in a way that I had not been previous to that. So I think it's something that's always important for us to be mindful of and to keep in our minds at all times. As we mentioned this past year during the Wave Sheaf Offering Bible study, this year, the weekly Sabbath occurred on the first day of unleavened bread, which was also one of the high days. So we begin the counting process from the Wave Sheaf Offering forward to get to the 50 days. And I mentioned this because it's quite possible, and I use the word possible, I want to stress that the events that we see in Joshua 5 that some in the churches of God have used to say, well, if there's not a Sabbath, then you got to go and count from the holy day. The events that we see in Joshua 5 could very well parallel the timing of what we have this year, in that it could have very well been that it was on a weekly Sabbath that the holy day occurred on as well. There are some other possible scenarios that I've read as well that can point to that too. But here's the thing. When we read this counting, and you can go ahead and start turning over to Leviticus 23, it's important that we see that there's instruction given of counting, and there's no asterisk that says, unless there's no weekly Sabbath within the days of unleavened bread, then count the first day of unleavened bread. No, we don't see that. What we see in Leviticus 23, beginning in verse 15, and this is after there's been, the discussion of the wave sheaf, then it goes on to say, you shall also count for yourselves. I want you to don't lose sight of that important little phrase. You are to count for yourselves. Let that sink in for a minute, because we're going to come to that in a little bit later. From the day after the Sabbath, notice it's the Sabbath. If you look at the Hebrew, last year I spent a great deal talking about this. I will say this, I wanted to speak on the subject I'm speaking on today last year, but because there was such an issue internally, I felt like I had to do the other, and I never really came back to this, and this is my fault, so that's why I wanted to bring it up today. But notice that the Hebrew is referencing the weekly Sabbath when it says after the Sabbath. From the day when you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, there shall be 7 complete Sabbaths. Not 7 complete annual first days of unleavened bread, but 7 Sabbaths. And this is all consistent with when you begin counting. Now the Sabbath, as I said before, the weekly Sabbath can be on a holy day, but the holy day can oftentimes not be on the Sabbath like it was last year. Meaning you just punt to the next weekly Sabbath, and then you start counting, and it falls outside of the days of unleavened bread. And really, the wave sheaf offering is far more connected to Pentecost than it is to the days of unleavened bread. There's separate meanings associated with these things. The first of the first fruits is the wave sheaf offering, Jesus Christ, the barley, and then the Feast of Weeks, Harvest, and Pentecost is where we come to the first fruits that follow along with Jesus Christ. So there's connectivity there that it really has nothing to do with what we see in the days of unleavened bread, at least from that strong connection point. It goes on to say, and you shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath, and then you shall present a new grain offering to the Lord, and you shall bring in from your dwelling places 2 loaves of bread for a wave offering, made of 2/10 of an ephod, and there shall be fine flour baked with leaven as first fruits to the Lord. And of course, as we go on, we'll have some discussions and possible some messages regarding that. But I want to draw from that 2 things. And the first thing is that you, according to the direction given here, yourself are to count. It is to be a part of what you do in your mind, not relying on someone else to calculate it for you. You are to count this in your mind and keep track of this with the 7 Sabbaths. And notice that there's no asterisk in there that says, unless there's no weekly Sabbath within the days of unleavened bread, which then you flip back to go into the first holy day. That's not in there. What we see is it's very consistent, simple, and there's no asterisk. In fact, there's no asterisk even listed with Joshua 5, which some people have utilized in churches of God to start counting with the holy day, even though it's not on a weekly Sabbath. So we see that there's 2 types of counting here as well. There's Sabbaths and there's days. There's 7 complete Sabbaths and there's 50 days. So there's 2 ways to count. And they are very consistent with one another about how, when you start from the right date, you come to the appropriate day of 50. Of course, we get the term Pentecost, not from the Hebrew, but from the Greek. And of course, that comes from Acts chapter 2. And we'll be speaking about that, I'm sure, in the coming weeks. But with Acts chapter 2, there's reference to the fact that on the Feast of Pentecost, when the church came together, because it was a holy day, they were all assembled in one accord, as I think some translations use. But that's where we get the term Pentecost. It's not from the Hebrew, it's from the Greek. But it means nothing more in the Greek than 50. But there's some significance here that I think is important for us to consider when we're talking about why we're doing this. We talk about a lot of things in the holy days, and we don't know everything. And if we think we know everything, then we're probably somewhat self-deluded. But I think that it's important for us to always understand that there are aspects of the holy days that we grow in understanding year after year. We keep them year after year. And I know in some cases, some people have said, well, we've heard this over and over and over, and why are we repeating it? And I know there's a lot of reasons why you can point to why we need to keep it on an ongoing basis. First and foremost, because God says to. Let's not argue. Let's not quibble. Just do what you're told. You know, what is the old saying? If all else fails, just do what you're told to do. Not necessarily by man, but by God. Just do what you're told to do and quit trying to make it complicated. And sometimes, and I'm not trying to mitigate the fact that life can be complicated, because it can. And there are a lot of questions. And here's the thing. Moses said what's revealed to us is for us to know. And there are some things that we will not know. And I hope that everyone can be comfortable with that. I know years ago I had someone that I think very, very fondly of. And his particular thought is, you can figure out when Jesus Christ is returning by what's in the Bible. And I'm like, that's not what I read. I'm okay not knowing. And you know, and there's so many other things. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't study and be diligent, not by a long stretch. But by the same token, understanding that while we're in this flesh, there are some hidden things that are God's, and we need to be comfortable somewhat with knowing that. So when we read this, we see a simple, consistent methodology. Now, lest you think that the controversies that go on within the churches of God are new, you would be wrong. I would be wrong. There was a split between the Pharisees and Sadducees of how to count these days. Based on what I've been able to read and from historical counts, the Pharisees did think that you began keeping the first day of unleavened bread, and that's when you started the calculation and the counting process. And the reason, as I understand it, is that they always wanted Pentecost to come up on Sivan 6. The Sadducees were different. They followed, in this particular case, more along the lines of the weekly Sabbath being the point of calculation, not the holy day. And of course, you know, this is no ringing endorsement of the Sadducees by any stretch of an imagination. You remember the last day of unleavened bread, we referenced the fact that, you know, Jesus told his disciples, told his church to beware of the leaven that was of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and Herod. Leaven associated with problems. Leaven of hypocrisy, as he clearly identifies with the Pharisees. Leaven of the Sadducees, meaning disbelief, because we know they didn't believe in resurrections and they didn't believe in angels, which is very counterintuitive to the plans of God. And then the leaven of Herod, who was nothing more worried about than materialism and worldlyism, cutting deals with Pilate. And Jesus was very, very concerned about his disciples, and he referenced them, and they even recognized, hey, he's not talking about bread here, he's talking about mentalities, and breads are only representations of these mentalities. And there is a connectivity to those, because those things are somewhat sins when we think about it. Sin of disbelief, sin of hypocrisy, and then sin of the world around us and not separating ourselves from the world around us in the evil and wrong ways. So those are things for us to think about. But it does seem very clear with these instructions we just read that when we're counting using a weekly Sabbath, and we're counting 7 of those, and then we're counting days at the same time, which is a different way of counting when you think about it, because it's almost as if Sabbaths are chunks of time, weeks associated with them, but days are a smaller unit of time. And that smaller unit of time, I think, an opinion, I try to always express these things as much as I think to do this. I think that it's always because this is to be top of mind, not just every Sabbath, but every day. And I think there's symbolism in that, just an idea, just a thought. But you think about it, what's so important about 7 complete Sabbaths? What's so important about 50 days? It is the only one of the holy days for which we don't have a set day, like the first day of such and such month, the 15th day of the first month. It's always a bit of a difference, and it's never on a particular time, and it is something that requires that we count for ourselves and not rely on other people so much, but make sure that it's something you're doing on an ongoing basis. And I asked the question, is there any significance to this? Some people would say, well, no, God says do it, so that settles it, so I do it. And I get that. But I do think there's more to the point and some things for us to consider, to think through. I mean, is 50 just some great round number? Is 7 just a number because people think it means complete and total, 7 days a week and whatnot? I don't know. And there could be, as we possibly go into the millennium, we go into the kingdom of God, and we're given so much more understanding, all knowledge at a particular point in time, possibly. But there is this unique aspect of mathematical processes, and thinking through and keeping track of something. The counting is something that is relevant even to the ministry of Jesus Christ. Let's turn over to Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. We studied this in a Bible study some time ago, and we oftentimes talk about this when some individuals are contemplating baptism and contemplating making a commitment with their lives and committing to walk within the covenant of God and walk with Jesus Christ. We see here that Jesus makes a very strong delineation between his disciples, and he uses the word disciples many times, not followers, disciples. And there's a difference between the two. But beginning in verse 25 of Matthew 14, he says, now large crowds were going along with him. These are followers. A lot of people follow, but not everyone is a disciple. He goes on to say, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and our own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And there's a delineation between a follower and a disciple, because we're talking about commitment here. He's not talking about, it doesn't appear to be that he's talking about physically hating your family. It's just that nothing else is going to become as important as you becoming in this relationship with him as a disciple. Verse 27, whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not sit down first and calculate the cost? Doing math, counting, I think as some translations use. Counting, calculating, depending on the translation you have, to see if he has enough to complete it. Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and is not able to finish it, all who observe it begin to ridicule it, saying, this man began to build and he's not able to finish. And what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will he not first sit down and consider whether he's strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Again, we're talking about numbers here and calculations and counting. They got more than I got. Maybe this isn't such a good idea. Just, but I mean, there's more that goes into it, but the point of it is that there's calculations going on. Counting yourself, not relying on someone else, but mentally, something's going on in the mind to keep up with something. Something for us, I think there's a connectivity back to Leviticus 23 and the counting for yourself. He goes on to say in verse 32, or else while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks terms for peace. So then none of you will be my disciple if he does not give up all of his possessions. And that's what it seems like Jesus is really pointing to here, is that it is the giving up of everything else in our life, and we give ourselves a total commitment. We count. Is this a wise choice? We calculate the impacts of what this could mean. Let's turn over to Isaiah chapter 65. As we're calculating and thinking about our life, and calculating and thinking about our commitment, calculating and thinking about the next of God's holy days and what it pictures, whether we're going to be a firstborn, or first fruit, I should say, then, we have to follow the firstborn, and we have to follow in his steps. It's interesting. We can be called, set apart, as the Israelites were called and set apart, and we can still be rebellious. We know throughout the duration of the time that the Israelites were walking in their journey for 40 years that they rebelled constantly. They murmured constantly. And they had, as we know from Hebrews, and we saw on the last day of unleavened bread, they had hearts of disbelief, which was a sin, so much so that it allowed their bodies and carcasses to be spread out the wilderness even in this time, except for those who God decreed that were 20 years and under. We'll come to that in just a minute. But here in Isaiah chapter 65, God makes a point of saying something, and I'm going to read a couple of different translations because different translations of the Bible will bring in this concept of counting and properly counting and weighing the cost of decisions that lead to being either faithful to God or not being faithful to God. And I'm going to read first from the King James Version in verse 11 and 12. The King James Version reads, "But you are they that forsake the Lord, that forget my holy mountain, that prepare a table for that troop, and that furnish the drink offering unto that number. Therefore I will number you to sword, and you shall all bow down to the slaughter. Because when I called, you did not answer, and when I spake, you did not hear, but did evil before mine eyes, and did choose that within that I delighted not." That's the King James. The New King James adds in some additional words, and we'll come to some of the meanings of these words. In verse 11, it says, "But you are those who forsook the Lord, who forgot my holy mountain, who prepare a table for Gad," G-A-D. You may remember Gad was one of the tribes of Israel, but that's not what this means. This term Gad, and if you have a reference in your Bible like I have, there's Gad that's going to give a meaning to this. It goes on to say, "And who furnished a drink offering for Menna. Therefore I will number you for the sword, and you shall all bow down to the slaughter. Because when I called, you did not answer. When I spoke, you did not hear. But you did evil before my eyes and chose that in which I did not delight." Now, the Bible that I'm reading from typically, and that I read a lot from, is the New American Standard. And it says, "But you who forsook the Lord, who forgot my holy mountain, set a table for fortune." Gad in the Hebrew is a concept of numbers that you count for fortune, like fortune telling. Somewhat similar and akin to astrology. You're looking for answers and things that, and counting of numbers that aren't, and you're not counting like you should be counting on me. You're counting on these other things for fortune and leaving it up to foreign gods, basically. It goes on to say, "And will fill up cups mixed with wine for destiny. I will destine you for the sword, and all of you will bow down to the slaughter. Because I called, but you did not answer. I spoke, but you did not hear. And you did evil in my sight and chose that which I do not delight." And obviously we know God delights in his law. We know from David, who meditated on God's law, he delighted in God's law. So we see, and I reference this word Gad in the New King James, that's translated in my Bible as fortune. And the word actually is a semblance of a false god that you count on, you calculate to, or a god of fortune. And the idea, the concept behind it is a God for which you count numbers towards. So counting is dependent on whether we're counting correctly or not counting correctly. And I think there's more to the 7 Sabbaths and the concept of counting and the 50 days than what sometimes meets our eyes. Now, I referenced as well that in the verse 11, it mentions in the New King James, who furnish a drink offering for minna. And minna is also another word in the Hebrew that means to number. So they're doing these drink offerings to number for the purposes of calculating their own way, their own path, their own fortune. And they're using their own calculations, superstitions and whatnot. And, you know, you think about it and you're like, well, that's ancient Israel. They followed false gods, Baal and Moloch and all kinds of gods. But, you know, there's a lot of that even today in the world you and I live in. Here in Birmingham, Leanne and I went downtown a couple of weeks ago to a place. I didn't know that there is a witchcraft place and a place for which if you want to go have like a New Orleans event, there's right downtown Birmingham. They got a huge store in there. You can go in and get all kinds of stuff that's about voodoo and witchcraft and whatnot in Birmingham, Alabama in the year 2022 or 2022. It's just amazing. You know, and I think that we think sometimes that all this is just ancient history. No, it's very relevant to the world you and I live in today, and we need to be careful with it. We need to be counting in the right things and the right numbers, and the right numbers are things that lead to what we're depending and relying upon. Let's turn over to Matthew chapter 7, because what this is really talking about is judgment. We got to make judgments in our life. And we got to, as we say today, make sure that we are banking on the right thing. And that's a euphemism. That's a metaphor, I should say, not a euphemism. And it is something for us to think about. But I think it's important for us because the process of counting, the process of calculation, whether it is Jesus talking about your commitment to him in the covenant arrangement, whether it's in the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament, Jesus Christ, talking about if you will calculate and count on the right way and the right things, then you can come to the point of being a first fruit. But if you calculate on the wrong things, you're not going to be a first fruit. Judgment becomes a part of your decision, my decisions. Matthew 7, verse 1 through 2, Jesus says, do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by the standard of measure, it will be measured to you. We understand Jesus is referencing the Pharisees who judged everybody else as being less than them. We might say, or use the term subpar spiritually. That's gone on in the churches of God for a long time. Dare say it goes on in any churches of God. There are certain people that will look at other people and think, well, he's just not as spiritual as I am. He's not as well versed as I am. And there is that sense of superiority, that sense of spiritual judgment and measuring another person. But Jesus makes the point here that if your calculations, your judgments, and your measurements that you're doing with other people, then that's going to be the standard that's used to calculate, measure, and count you and count me. Which leads many times for us to maybe rethink some of our thoughts if we're careful and to become a little more humble. There's another form of counting that involves math, involves a process that we see that's in the book of Revelation. Let's turn over to Revelation chapter 11. Like it or not, we are all being measured. We are all being calculated. We are all being counted right now. And there will come a time in the future when there are two witnesses, and they're going to have a couple of different jobs. They're going to be proclaiming the gospel message, and they're going to be God's representatives on earth, unlike possibly an impostor who is in the form of other religious organizations in the world, and maybe even in the churches of God. who thinks that they are God's representative. But these are two individuals that are the true representatives. And we see here in verse 1, and then there was given unto me a measuring rod like a staff. And someone said, get up and measure the temple of God, the altar and those who worship in it. Lest you think that one of the jobs of these two witnesses is to calculate measurements of a physical structure that many people want to focus on, a third temple building. I don't think that's what he's talking about here, because you can't physically calculate measurements regarding people, and those are the ones who worship in it. I think what he's referencing here is a calculation, a measuring, a counting of the individuals in the temple of God, not a physical structure that is going to be on a particular place that some people put a lot of focus on. Notice in verse 2, he says, leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread it underfoot, the holy city, for 42 months. What do we draw from all of this? Well, I think that there is some spiritual applications. There's some counting going on, and there's a time and period for which the church and the temple of God, as the Apostle Paul references in the book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, you are the temple of God. And you are those who worship in the temple of God, before the altar of God. Not a physical structure, but God is measuring his temple. And he will measure it at the very end, whenever this is, for his purposes. So we see that maybe there's a measurement of the people of God, and this is done by these witnesses, and there's a measurement that is done of their fitness, how well they're performing, and then maybe there is a measurement to see, will these people be able to endure? I don't know, just some thoughts, some things to consider when we look at this. But the point I'm driving to is the whole idea of measuring and counting is a form of judgment and evaluation. And this evaluation is of the people. And when you see, well, what could it mean? It says the temple and the altar and those who worship. The totality, possibly, of everyone in the church. Ministers, non-ministers. It could be everybody is going to be evaluated, the whole temple. And we're not, again, I don't think, speaking specifically of only a physical structure. We're talking about the temple of God. In fact, there's reference to this in 1 Peter. Let's turn over to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 4. Very familiar scripture. And as we are in the process now of numbering and counting Sabbaths and days to the next of God's holy days, the feast of first fruits, the feast of harvest is also called, and the Feast of Weeks, as it's called in the Old Testament. Understand that there's more going on than just keeping up with numbers. Numbers are important, but the numbers of the evaluation and the calculations of you and I is one of the aspects that we need to consider. Here in verse 14 of 1 Peter chapter 4, it says, if you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffer as a murderer, as a thief, or an evildoer, or a troublesome meddler. But anyone who suffers as a Christian is he who is not to be ashamed, but to glorify God in this name. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God, the temple of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome of those who do not obey the gospel of God? Again, there's allusions to a timetable with Revelation 11 in the future, but there's an allusion here with the Apostle Peter, even going back to the church right after Jesus Christ's death and resurrection and ascension, that on an ongoing basis, the apostolic, as it's oftentimes called, era of the church is being judged, and you and I are being judged even as a part going all the way forward. It goes on to say in verse 18, and if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what shall be the outcome, or what shall become of the godless man and the sinner? You know, I think when we read that, we marry that with what we saw in Matthew 7. You know, even on our best days, which they're probably less of the better days than there are of the other days, but hopefully the older we get, the more we do these things, the more we calculate ourselves, our relationship, our covenant, the more we count our lives going forward, and we evaluate ourselves, and we judge ourselves with the right judgment, the right calculations. Hopefully we're getting better. But even if we are getting better and turning in a better direction, it's, as we say, by the skin of our teeth, which ain't a whole lot of skin on your teeth, that we will get in. And, you know, you look at the Pharisees, and Jesus said, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, and they were such great caretakers of doing all these physical things right, yet inside they were full of hypocrisy, full of disbelief with the Sadducees, and full of worldliness with Herod. Verse 19 says, therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God will entrust their souls to the faithful Creator in doing what is right. Even those measured at the very time of the end by the two witnesses, the temple of God's measured in Revelation 11, you know, it's still a process by which there may be those who fall and suffer. But he makes the point very clearly, even going back to the apostolic time, if you're going to suffer, make sure it's not because you deserve it, because you broke God's laws. Make sure you are suffering because you're doing what's right. You're measuring yourself against the right measuring stick. That seems to be the message that we're seeing here in Peter's epistle to the church. And we think about it, you know, it's important for you and I to make sure that we are unifying ourselves with the right thing. Think about this for just a moment. A lot of churches of God speak about unity. They utilize Psalms 133 about how great and wonderful it is for the brethren to be together in peace and unity. And that is true. But they utilize that in order to have a coercive peace, kind of like the Romans had Pax Roma. There was peace through force. We see that in the physical world around us. That's going on in churches of God as well. Really, what we need to be doing is focusing on our unity as we consider our measuring of ourselves, evaluating ourselves on an ongoing basis through these 7 complete weeks and these 50 days as just a metaphor of continual evaluation of ourselves through the duration of our lives. Make sure that we're unifying with the right things. Let's turn over to Exodus, chapter 26. You know, I find it interesting, and I read this last night, and I was like, I need to bring that up. That's something that I read years and years ago, and it really, quite frankly, shame on me, kind of forgotten about it. But you may recall, when you go back into Exodus, there's this whole construction in chapter 25 of the Ark of the Covenant, the creating of the tent of meeting, and individuals were given specific skills. They were probably quite good, but they weren't good enough to do what God wanted to do. And it appears, at least from what I read, my opinion, is that this was probably as close to perfection in the creation of this as anything that had physically been done, as a replication of God and how perfect he is. But these individuals were given skills that were enhanced by God. Only certain people. And they were the ones creating this. And in chapter 26, in the first part, verses 1 through 4, there's reference to these linens that are given. And these linens, when you think about it, could very well be close and similar to what we talk about when we talk about linens of righteousness, the robes of righteousness that are dipped in the blood of Jesus Christ. And we talk about, you know, putting on Jesus Christ and the clothing of righteousness, as the Apostle Paul says, through Jesus Christ. It's a physical representation of potentially something metaphoric that's greater in understanding. But in verse 5, there's something that I think is very, very interesting about the number 50 that's listed here. It says, and you shall make 50 loops in one curtain, and you shall make 50 loops on the edge of the curtain that is in the second. set of loops shall be opposite each other. And you shall make 50 clasps of gold, and join the curtains to one another with the clasps, so that the tabernacle will be a unit. Unity. Continuing down into verse 10, he says, and you shall make 50 loops on the edge of the curtain that is on the outermost in the first set, and 50 loops on the edge of the curtain that is on the outermost in the second set. And you shall make 50 clasps of bronze, and you shall put the clasp into the loops and join the tent together so that it will be a unit. Again, I don't want to draw unnecessarily, but I find it interesting that the number 50 is used in relative to the tent of meeting, which will later be translated obviously into the temple. But I find it interesting as well. If you go back and look in 1 Kings and Chronicles, in the book of Kings and Chronicles, I guess I should say, when the temple was being built by Solomon, God at first didn't want the temple. He was perfectly content with this tent of meeting. But David wanted to build a house and God accepted it. But this number of 50 we don't see listed anywhere in that physical structure. We do see the number 50 come up in Ezekiel 40 when we talk about a temple that's in the millennium. And so many times that's looked at as being somewhat of a figure, a metaphor for the church. But that number does come up again in Ezekiel 40 in the millennial temple, but it's not in the physical temple that's here on the earth. But there was the number 50 associated with here and the tent of meeting, and it is associated with unity. I just bring this up as a thought. Sometimes I think we make too much out of numbers, and sometimes I don't think we think enough about numbers. This idea of why 50, why is it important to have 50 days? Possibly for you and I to be interlooped in such a way with the tent of meeting where God was, where he met with Moses and Aaron and the children of Israel at the entrance, that you and I are to be a unit with him. I think it's a possibility. Again, I don't want to draw too much towards numbers because sometimes people get, and this is my words here, they get kind of wild with some of the numbers and they count numbers to the wrong thing. And we don't want to count numbers to the wrong things because that's a warning from Isaiah 65. We need to be careful with numerology and be careful with how we think through things. Let's turn back to Leviticus chapter 25 this time. It's a little bit of a recap based on Leviticus 23, but there's something in Leviticus 25 that I want to read through. I think it's important for us to consider. And beginning in verse 8, it says, you shall also count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. And then you shall sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month, the day of atonement. And you shall sound a horn all through your land. And you shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land and all the inhabitants. And it shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his own family. I'm not trying to mix up Pentecost with the days of unleavened bread. The point that I'm drawing to, and the thing we need to consider here, is that there's a similar path of counting. There's a similar number of days and number of years for days and months for years for Sabbaths. And we see that once you reach that 50th year, there is a release. Possibly. Just ideas, possibly when we count with the right measurement, we measure ourselves in the right way, and when we are born as first fruits, we are released from this physical body, and we are resurrected as first fruits, or changed in the moment, the twinkling of an eye, possibly with the Feast of Trumpets. You see some similarities in all of this. It's not a set thing, but you see a consistent factor here, I think, with numbers, and you see a consistent factor as well with overall plans of God, potentially, utilizing holy days, utilizing counting, utilizing the counting of the same simple consecrated methodologies. And I think about this. I don't know that I have ever seen, I don't see it in the Bible, maybe you could show it to me if you see it, where the Israelites ever really kept this Jubilee year. It could be that it just never was recorded. I don't know. But man, can you think of how wonderful that is? Just put yourself in your mind. I don't know about you. I'm 56 years old. The older I get, the more I'm kind of looking retirement, looking like, man, that looks like a great day. Now, I'm physically thinking of something that you never spiritually retire. I'm not trying to draw that analogy by any means. But what I'm saying is that there's a release from a grueling, monotonous, everyday work and all the burdens and pressures that go along with that. And yet we see here that every 7 years they got a release, or 49th year, I should say, after the counting of these 7 years. And then there was another year, the 50th year, there's also a release. But they had to keep up with it. And with that release came a lot of other reforms, and whether it was through balance sheets and whatnot, there was a resetting of things. And I cannot help but think that there's some spiritual understanding there for you and I when we consider being first fruits, and then when we are changed, and then when we are finally, totally as God is, and we reach that fullness of understanding and knowledge, a release from some of the false ideas and things of lack of knowledge that we have. Can you see some of the parallels, I guess is what I'm saying? Some things to think about. Some things to hopefully give us some hope to continue as we focus on ourselves, to count for ourselves our lives, redeem our time. There's another calculation of time, and I won't turn to this. You can write it down if you're taking notes. Numbers 1, verses 1 through 3. And it says there that God spoke to Moses in the wilderness at Sinai in the tabernacle of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they come out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel by families, by their fathers' houses, and according to the number of the names, every male individual from 20 years and above who are able to go to war. And you and Aaron shall number them by the armies. Now, we know David got in trouble for counting armies, and it caused some havoc in his life because he was calculating for his wrong purposes. Here we see a calculation for a godly purpose. So we need to be careful what we count with, and counting's important. And counting the cost is very important. But oftentimes people look at this, and I've read this many times, that there's 20-year-olds that went into the promised land, but the others did not. And as a result of the 20-year-olds that went in, there's some number of significance to that, to Psalms chapter 90. Let's turn to Psalms chapter 90. I want to caution people on this because this is one of those things that I'm not 100% sure. I see how people can draw the number idea, and they can draw the idea of connectivity to this, but I think it's a little bit of a stretch, but I just wanted to mention it just for the sake of discussion today. But in Psalms chapter 90, and this is verse 10, it says, as for the days of our lives, they contain 70 years, or due to strength, 80 years. Yet their pride is but labor and sorrow, for soon it is gone and we fly away. Who understands the power of your anger, speaking to God, and your fury, according to the fear that is due to you? So there is fear and respect and reverence, as well as an understanding that, hey, if he lowers the hammer on you, you're going to be squashed. You're not that invincible in the human form. Goes on to say, so teach us to number our days, that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. I submit to you and to myself that when we consider why we count, why is there a purpose for the counting of the 7 Sabbaths, the 50 days, even considering the Jubilee calculation of 7 Sabbaths for years, and the 49th year and the 50th year, it seems like there's some reasons for that. And the purpose, it seems, could be that we want to present to God a heart, a mind, like Jesus Christ, of wisdom, of skill. Yet, going back to this idea of 20, I've heard people make this discussion and they say, this isn't hard numbers, soft numbers. Heard that term several times. Or as I've used to have budgets years ago in the job that I had, they would always tell me, well, your numbers are close enough for government work. It's close enough. You know, you look at this number here, you got 70 years that are physical life. There seems to be, just in case, you know, 80 years, you know, if you're good and you do some things and favor is given your way, but understand that all life is ultimately just laboring in sorrow, ultimately, because we're looking for more. We're going beyond that. But if you take the 20 years for the children of Israel away from what was the standard 70 years of life, you come to 50. And I've heard people make the argument, well, you know, you think about that, then you got 20 years of adolescence, which means your time of counting when God's really looking to evaluate you is about 50 years. Now, here's the fly in the ointment. Some people don't live to be 70. Did they get shortchanged? Some people live to be 100. Did they just couldn't get enough right that God just gave them more time and was, just, you know, see, that's where you get into a lot of this, like, come on, let's not get too much into the numbers. But I think as a general rule, God may evaluate us based on timing. And the timing, he looks at us and he makes evaluations and judgments of whether we'll be a first fruit or not. Something for us to consider if we're carefully calculating the life that we're living now. And we're evaluating on the right things, the things of God, the right fear due to God, the right humble state of mind, not as we see in the world around us today, you created me as a male, but I've decided I'm a female because I know better than you know. We can't have that kind of mentality, that kind of heart. Our heart has to be that of wisdom, of skill, with humility. And I think when we think about this purpose of judgment and time, you know, wisdom truly is the process that we're going through in our lives. And when we're called and God begins to work with us and we do our part and he's doing his part, it's a process of you and I becoming wise and skillful with spiritual growth, developing from our understanding. And you think about it, first you have to have knowledge. You got to have the right source. After knowledge, you kind of have to have understanding of what the knowledge means. Okay. And we still struggle with that. And if you think you don't, then I'd say you probably need to look at yourself a little more closely. You might find that we're all inconsistent in several things in our lives. And then finally comes wisdom. It's like the third leg in that stool. And wisdom is the ability to execute the understanding in the right way. So you have to have the right knowledge, the understanding from the knowledge, and then execute it with the skill to be able to navigate the life appropriately. While we're here in Psalms, let's turn over to Psalms 39. David, many times what we read here in Psalms 90 is attributed to Moses, but David also gives us some understanding and a thoughtful, I think, process for us to consider in Psalms 39. And read verse 4, Lord, make me to know my end, and what is the extent of my days? Let me know how transient I am. I think that's important. I think that's a key element. We oftentimes talk about teenagers. They think they're bulletproof and invincible, do stupid stuff. Reality of it is, while we may get older and we can't do some of the stupid stuff we once did mentally, we're just as stupid. But our physical bodies are keeping us from doing some of the stupid stuff we once did. But mentally, we have this idea, we think we're still superior. And that's a wrong mindset. The mind that we should have, that is a mind of wisdom, is what we see here by David. Let me know the limits of myself, and let me realize how imperfect I am. That's a humbleness of mind that you and I need to understand, and to make sure if we do this, that we're uniting ourselves like those rings, clasps, for which the tent of meeting is, that we are a unit with God. Solomon makes the comment in Ecclesiastes 4 about a threefold cord is not quickly broken. You know, if we have right knowledge, right understanding, and right wisdom together with God, we're in unity with Him. That's a pretty strong bound. It's something for us to think about, where we're building and how we're building. Let's turn over to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. I think this kind of lends itself towards, we've talked a little bit, honestly, alluding to some of the things as far as the leaven of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and now a little bit of Herod. Ephesians chapter 5 gives us an insight that is a little bit of an allusion to what Jesus was probably referencing when he was referencing the leaven of Herod. Beginning in verse 8 of chapter 5, here in Ephesians, it says, "For you you were formerly in darkness, but now you're in light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, as the fruit of the light consists of all goodness and righteousness and truth, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. For it is a disgrace even to speak of things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed by light, and everything that becomes visible is light. For this reason I say, awake, sleeper, arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. So then do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." There is an evaluation of the times around us, the events, as well as the mentalities of the world around us that we need to be mindful of. And we're not to walk in the ways of darkness, cutting deals, as we saw Herod with Pilate. We have to be very, very careful with the way that we walk in the world around us. I think some translations use the word that you are to walk circumspectly, not as fools. You know, you and I, we have to be careful. All the disciples of Christ, those who are true followers of Christ, in the form that they follow, and they follow in such a way that they want to emulate and they want to replicate what Jesus Christ did, not just his understanding, but they seek an understanding with wisdom, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And I would submit to you and to myself that could be a difference between a follower and a disciple. You know, we also have, and I won't turn there, but I'll reference in Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 2, after we have all these individuals of faith that are listed in what's oftentimes called Hebrews 11, the faith chapter, the Apostle Paul, if he is the person who wrote the book of Hebrews, makes the comment that you take their examples, and as a result of that, in verses 1 through 2, he says, strip away all the sin that so easily besets us. And as a part of our numbering of our days, understanding ourselves and how transient we truly are in this flesh, and how we need to be united with the tent of meeting, with the God of the tent of meeting, and be unified with him during the time frame of life we have, we redeem the times appropriately. We count the times appropriately, and we count our lives appropriately. Let's turn over to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13. I don't think it's any stretch of an imagination for us to consider the world we live in is pretty evil. And we see evidence of that in a host of many different examples. But here in verse 11 of Romans chapter 13, it says, do this knowing the time, that it is already the hour for you, speaking to the church, that's you and that's me, to awaken from sleep. For salvation is nearer to you, or nearer to us rather, than we believed. The night is almost gone, and the day is near. Therefore, let us lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave properly as in the day, not carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provisions for the flesh in regards to its lust. You know, I think that's pretty straightforward when we think about it. And I think that's a part of how we need to evaluate ourselves. Let's turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. We have a part to play in all of this, understanding that we do not earn salvation by any stretch of an imagination, but we have a part to still play in that. And I submit to you and to myself that the part that we have to play is the time of the counting of these 7 Sabbaths, the 50th day. All of this points towards duration of life, a calculation, a measurement, an evaluation, a judgment of ourselves, not looking at other people, but judging ourselves and looking deep within ourselves on an ongoing basis to the time frame for which we could be born as first fruits. But here in chapter 6, verse 1, it says, and working together with him. Notice that. We are to work with him, not against him. We also urge you not to receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, at the acceptable time I listened to you, and on the day of salvation I helped you. Behold, now is the acceptable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. We realize that today is not the only day of salvation for everyone in the world around us, but for those who have made the commitment, counted the cost, and entered into the covenant, now is the time. Now is our time of salvation, the day of our salvation. The 7 complete Sabbaths, the 50th days. Now is the time. Verse 17, therefore come out from their midst and be separate, speaking of the world around us, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean, and I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Eternal. You know, when we think about it, go all the way back to Leviticus 23:15. You shall count for yourself. Are we counting ourselves in this?